Hello and welcome to the History of Maritime Wrestling Episode 2 as we cover Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling. This episode will also feature Joel from Wrestling with the Bros. Now, to start off here, we're going to talk about how Emile Dupree got Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling. One rumor is that Emile just took the promotion from Cowboy Len Hughes. The rumor is that Cowboy Len Hughes was illiterate, could not read or write, and his right-hand man was Emile Dupree. Supposedly, the only thing that Len Hughes could do was write his name. So the rumor is that Emile made some documents and told Len, sign these papers, and basically he signed away the company to Emile Dupree. That to me sounds like some tall tales. I don't know if I believe that or not, but that is a rumor. The first card I could find with the name Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling was on June 13th, 1961. The two big stars on that card is Emile Dupree and Pat Patterson. Other wrestlers wrestling for Grand Prix Wrestling in the early to mid-60s include Haystacks Muldoon, Bull Curry, former boxer Yvon Durel, The Beast, Rudy Kay, Don Jardine, Paul Peller, who wrestled as the Black Spider, Leo Burke, who wrestled at one point as Batman, future NWA World Heavyweight Champion Ronnie Garvin, female wrestlers Lucille Dupree and Mary Jane Mull, Bob Sweetan, the Little Wrestlers Fuzzy Cupid, Sonny Boy Cassidy, Cowboy Bradley, and Tiny Tim, Rocky Johnson, this is the father of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Archie Goldie, Al Costello, and Edouard Carpentier. One of the first big rivalries in Grand Prix Wrestling was Emile Dupree versus two of the four Cormier brothers, Rudy Kay and The Beast. There were some years that The Beast would go by the name of Ivan the Lumberjack.
In the year of 1968, Archie Goldie would bring another company's title to Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling. He would come into the company and bring the Stampede Wrestling North American title with him and defend it a few times. He would go on to defend it against some of the best wrestlers we've seen perform around this era, including Rocky Johnson, Emile Dupree, The Beast, David Roll, Yvon Durel, and Edouard Carpentier. This would be the first time a title would show up and be seen for Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling.
In the early to mid-1970s, some of the big stars wrestling for Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling would include Don Leo Jonathan, Sweet Daddy Siki, The Cuban Assassin, Andre the Giant, Dino Bravo, Gino Brito, The UFO, Big Bad John, Killer Carl Krupp, Joe Ventura, Mitsui Yoshida, this is the future Riki Choshu of New Japan Pro Wrestling and All Japan Pro Wrestling. And at the end of the decade, the Poffo family would join Grand Prix Wrestling. This was Angelo Poffo, who would wrestle under a mask under the name Carpetbagger, and his two sons, Leaping Lanny Poffo and the legendary multi-time world champion Macho Man Randy Savage. Other stars that would wrestle for Grand Prix in the 70s would include Big Steven Petipa, Hercules Simard, which is the future hustler Rip Rogers, future WWF Women's Champion Leilani Kai, Vicky Williams, Goldie Rogers, and the Great Malumba. In 1972, Sweet Daddy Siki is listed as defending a North American Championship. I don't think this is the Calgary version of the North American title that was defended by Archie Goldie. I'm not sure if it's just a random title that they called the North American title, but he is listed as defending a North American title. Something very similar happens in 1974. There are some cards where Killer Carl Krupp is defending an international heavyweight title. I don't think it's the same international title that we would see in the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s, but he is defending an international title. Also in 1974, Dino Bravo and Gino Brito would bring over the Quebec version of Grand Prix Wrestling's tag team titles and defend them in the Maritimes. They would even lose the Grand Prix tag team titles to the Cuban Assassins. Cuban Assassin 1, that's the original Angel Acevedo, and his tag team partner Cuban Assassin 2. According to websites like Cage Match and WrestlingData.com, this Cuban Assassin's title reign is unofficial. And for anybody wondering, yes, there were two Grand Prix Wrestlings running at the same time. The Quebec version of Grand Prix Wrestling ran from 1971 to 1975 and was founded by the Vachon brothers, Maurice Mad Dog Vachon and Paul the Butcher. In 1978, Grand Prix would get the titles that we all remember, the International Heavyweight title and the North American Tag Team titles. Leaping Lanny Poffo would be crowned the first ever International Heavyweight Champion. He would lose that title to his brother, Macho Man Randy Savage. Savage would lose it back to Lanny Poffo, and then Poffo would lose it back to the Macho Man. For 2 seasons, the Poffo brothers would have a legendary rivalry for the International Heavyweight Championship. In 1979, Macho Man would lose the title to Killer Karl Krupp. The first North American Tag Team Champions would be the Cuban Assassin and the Carpetbagger. This was Angelo Poffo. The second champions would be the Cuban Assassin and Goldie Rogers. I am not sure if the belts were vacated or Goldie Rogers took the Carpetbaggers portion of the North American Tag titles, but they were the second champions. The final North American Tag Team Champions of the 1970s was Big Steven Pettipa and the Great Malumba. One thing that I have to mention about the tag titles, it depended the year. Some years it was the North American Tag Team titles. Sometimes it was the International Tag Team titles. Sometimes it was the Continental Tag Team titles. Why this change every once in a while, I have no idea. On websites, it's always known as the North American Tag Team titles, but I have seen videos where they are called the International Tag titles and the Continental Tag Team titles.
At the end of the 1979 season, Maritime fans would be disappointed as the Poffo family would move on from the Maritimes and eventually go on to bigger and better things for themselves. Also, between the 1979 season and the 1980 season, Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling would also stop using the International Heavyweight title, and they would introduce the United States Heavyweight title. And who do they crown as their first champion? None other than Dr. D. David Schultz.
In 1980, the North American Tag Team titles would be won by Hubert Gallant and Leo Burke. They would lose the titles on June 28, 1980 to No Class Bobby Bass and the Cuban Assassin. The Cuban Assassin at this point in time is really becoming a tag team specialist. Later that season, Cuban Assassin and Bobby Bass would lose the tag titles to Leo Burke and Big Steven Pettipa. In 1981, Killer Karl Krupp is defending the European Heavyweight Championship. He would defend the title versus the Great Malumba, Hercules Ayala from the WWC promotion in Puerto Rico. He would also defend the title against Mr. Hito and Keith Hart. This was Bret the Hitman Hart's brother. In 1982, Rick Valentine would win the United States Heavyweight Championship, and he would start a feud with Leo Burke. You might recognize Rick Valentine under a different name. He also wrestled as Kerry Brown. Valentine would lose the United States Heavyweight title to Leo Burke. The Cuban Assassin would form a new tag team, and he would even change his name for that season. He would go by the name of Angelo Castro. His tag team partner would be known as Raul Castro, and together they would be the Cubans. The Cubans would win the North American Tag Team titles that season. In 1983, Rick Valentine would win back the United States Heavyweight title from Leo Burke. Valentine would drop the belt back to Leo Burke that same season. This rivalry with Leo Burke and Rick Valentine is just one example why Leo Burke was the top guy in the Maritimes.
We would see the return of the international title in 1983 when Frenchie Martin went on to win the title but would soon lose it to Leo Burke, making him not only a double champion in Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling, holding the US Championship as well, but also a Triple Crown champion because at this time he also held the NWA North American Heavyweight Championship.
Other stars that would wrestle for Grand Prix in 1983 would include Leaping Lanny Poffo, Sweet Daddy Siki, Rudy K, and The Spoiler. The North American Tag Team Champions in 1983 are Bull Johnson and Vic Rosatani. They would lose the tag team titles later that season to Frenchie Martin and Rick Valentine. Both the International Heavyweight title and United States Heavyweight title would be vacated at the end of the season. 3 new titles would be introduced in 1984. The first one would be the British Empire title, held by Steve Casey. The second title would be the North American title, held by Killer Karl Krupp. The third title would be the Maritime Heavyweight Championship, held by Big Steven Pettipa. The North American Tag Team titles in 1984 were held by Bulldog Bob Brown and the Great Pogo. Other wrestlers in the territory in 1984 would include Archie Goldie, Lenny Montana, Sweet Daddy Siki, Stompin' Paul Peller, the UFO, Buddy Lane, Joe LeDuc, the Cuban Assassin, Little Tokyo, Little Coco, and Rene Rougeau. Rene Rougeau would later on go by the names of Dan Crawford and Phil LaFawn. The start of the 1985 season would see the return of the International Heavyweight title, and it was around the waist of the Super Destroyer. The Super Destroyer would lose the International title to Killer Karl Krupp, but Krupp would then lose it right back to the Super Destroyer. The Super Destroyer's manager at this point in time is Robert Joseph Bass III. You might also know him as No Class Bobby Bass. The Super Destroyer would also win the Maritime Heavyweight title, making him a double champion, beating Big Steven Pettipa for the title. They would continue to feud till Big Steven Pettipa would win both titles, making him the double champion. This would also be Big Steven Pettipa's only international heavyweight title reign. I know a lot of fans remember him as the Maritime Heavyweight Champion, but the International Heavyweight title was the top title. Not long after winning both titles, the Maritime title would be retired. Pettipa is the only 2-time Maritime champion in Grand Prix wrestling history. Steven Pettipa would lose the International Heavyweight title in August to Rotten Ron Starr, who would start his first championship reign. He would also finish 1985 as the International Heavyweight champion. The North American Tag Team Champions in 1985 were the Cuban Assassin and Sweet Daddy Siki. Later that season, Hans Hermann and Killer Karl Krupp would win the North American Tag Team titles. Other wrestlers in the territory in 1985 would include Velvet McIntyre, Leilani Kai, Sky Lolo, Man Mountain Mike, this is the future Norman the Lunatic, and Bastion Booger from both WWF and WCW. Also in the territory, the Great Malumba and Leo Burke. 1985 would also see the Cuban Assassin becoming a good guy and forming a legendary tag team with Leo Burke. Burke would also be one of the top challengers to Rotten Ron Starr's International Heavyweight title that year. 1985 actually has some surviving full shows on YouTube. Anything before that is most likely lost. Territory wrestling would usually be filmed in a studio, and it would be a way to sell the big shows on TV. Matches would usually be a big star versus an enhancement talent, and you would see the big main events at the live events at the arenas. Rarely would you see a title match on TV, let alone a title change. That all started to change in 1985 with the popularity of the WWF, so Grand Prix would have to start making changes as well. 1986 is the one year with the most shows that have been saved. 6 or 7 shows can be viewed on YouTube right now. In 1986, the season would start with Leo Burke as the International Heavyweight Champion and The Spoiler and Nikita Kalmakov as the International Tag Team Champions. First off, this is not the original Spoiler, but this is Calgary wrestler Carl Moffat, who also wrestled as Jason the Terrible in Calgary, not to be confused with Jason the Terrible in Japan, not the same guy. Also, the tag titles here are being called the International Tag Team titles, so you see what I mean with every year it could be named something differently. Something interesting about 1986, there are 2 title changes, and they are both televised, and they are both saved. You can watch these 2 title changes. The first one would happen on June 28th, 1986, when Maniac Frenchie Martin beat Leo Burke for the International Heavyweight title. The other title change would happen on August 30th, when Leo Burke and the Cuban Assassin beat the Spoiler and Nikita Kalmykov. One of the big non-championship feuds happening in the territory in 1986 is the returning Hercules Ayala feuding with the Iranian Sheik. The Iranian Sheik would also wrestle in other territories as the Angel of Death and would even work for WCW later on in his career. Man Mountain Mike is back in the territory, but this time under the name of Cousin Mike. Later on in the season, Cousin Mike would turn heel and feud with the Great Malumba. Maniac Frenchie Martin's top challenger for the International Heavyweight title was Hercules Ayala. They had a pretty good rivalry in 1986. One of their matches can be seen on YouTube, and it's not a match in studio, but it's in the arena.
In 1987, the Maritime wrestling scene would see more arena shows and a lot less shows recorded in studios. The reason being is because the territories were seriously struggling to survive in this moment in time. Also happening this year, Rotten Ron Starr would serve as international champion for the better part of 1987 and go on to defend his title against a multitude of talent, including Buddy Lane, the late great Leo Burke, Senior Warcloud, Bobby Hart, the Mighty Hercules, the Beast, and also Bob Crawford.
The North American Tag Team titles would be on Leo Burke and the Cuban Assassin to start the year. The belts would change hands 6 times in 1987. The other North American Tag Team champions that year would be the Rock and Roll Rebel Express. This was Dino Ventura and Kid Dynamite. Also, Bulldog Bob Brown and Rick Valentine would hold the North American Tag Team titles. These two teams, Valentine and Brown and the Rock and Roll Rebel Express, would trade the belts back and forth in 1987. Both teams would hold the titles 3 times each. Other stars competing in Grand Prix Wrestling in 1987 would include Killer Carl Krupp, the Great Malumba, Dr. Zhivago, Ivan the Terrible, Nature Boy Sweet Tan, Butcher Vachon, Stompin' Paul Peller, the Masked Thunderbolt, and Big Steven Pettipa. The Masked Thunderbolt is Ron Hutchinson under the mask. Ron Hutchinson helped train Edge, Christian, Trish Stratus, Gail Kim, Beth Phoenix, Tracy Brooks, Tiger Ali Singh, Johnny Swinger, and Joe E. Legend. On September 19th, 1987, the Beast beat Rotten Ron Starr in a chain match. This was not for the International Heavyweight title. The reason I mention this match is, growing up, I used to always hear the Beast and the chain match. This is far from the only chain match in Grand Prix Wrestling, but I wanted to mention it because it's such a legendary thing to hear, the Beast and a chain match. In 1988, Hustler Rip Rogers would start the year as the International Heavyweight Champion. He would defend the title that year versus Vinny Valentino, Pat O'Brien, Leo Burke, Dino Ventura, Rudy Diamond, and Buddy Lane. On August 18, 1988, Leo Burke would win the International Heavyweight title from Hustler Rip Rogers. Leo would have some title defenses versus Bulldog Bob Brown and would finish 1988 as the International Heavyweight Champion. Leo Burke and the Cuban Assassin would start 1988 as the North American Tag Team Champions, but would lose the belts to Bulldog Bob Brown and his new tag team partner from New Japan Pro Wrestling, Masahiro Chono. In Grand Prix, Chono was going by the name of Tokyo Chono. Chono and Brown would lose the North American Tag Team titles in September to International Champion Leo Burke and Big Steven Pettipa. Other wrestlers wrestling for Grand Prix in 1988 would include Jonathan Holiday, Bob Crawford, the tag team of the Super Bees, Sailor White, the Russian Bigfoot, Wayne Gillis, Eddie Watts, the Beast, Sky Lolo, Farmer Brooks, Stompin' Paul Peller, the UFO, the Great Malumba, Big Steven Pettipa, Butcher Vachon, and coming out of retirement for one more match, the great Emile Dupree. Going into 1989, the international heavyweight champion is Leo Burke. He would be champion for most of the season. He would feud with Rotten Ron Starr and eventually lose the title to Rotten Ron Starr. Ron Starr would then lose the international heavyweight title to the Dynamite Kid. Yes, the Dynamite Kid that had just left the WWF the previous year. One half of the British Bulldogs and former WWF World Tag Team Champion. Dynamite Kid would defend the International Heavyweight title on TV versus Bulldog Bob Brown, but not long after this, Dynamite Kid would lose the International Heavyweight title to Leo Burke. Not long after that, Ron Starr would beat Leo Burke to win back the International Heavyweight title, and Starr would finish the year as the International Champion. The North American Tag Team Champions in 1989 were Leo Burke and Big Steven Pettipaw, but later in the year, they would lose the titles to the Cuban Commandos. This was the Cuban Assassin and Jerry Morrow. Former NWA World Heavyweight Champion King Harley Race would wrestle in Grand Prix Wrestling in 1989, having a match on TV versus The Beast. The Beast would get the win over King Harley Race, but after the match, a wild brawl would break out. The two men in the middle of this brawl, the former partners and friends, Leo Burke and the Cuban Assassin. They feuded for years until Cuban Assassin turned face in 1985 and asked Leo Burke to be his partner. But now the Cuban Assassin was going back to his old ways. He would turn on Leo Burke and he would bust him open, ending their partnership and their friendship. After this wild brawl, Leo would cut a promo saying, "I invited you in my house. I fed you. I treated you better than my own brother." Leo would then say, "Remember, I never asked you to be my partner. You asked me." This was the rebirth of the hottest rivalry in the history of Maritime Wrestling. It's a rivalry still talked about to this very day. In 1990, Leo Burke would win the International Heavyweight title for a fifth time. This is the record for most International Heavyweight title reigns. He would feud with Hustler Rip Rogers, who was back in the territory, and he would lose the title to Hustler Rip Rogers, who would be champion for the rest of 1990. Rip Rogers would continue to feud and defend the title against Leo Burke, and would also defend the title against Big Steven Pettipaw and The Beast. In 1990, the tag titles are being called the Continental Tag Team Championships, and the champions are Diamond Timothy Flowers and No Class Bobby Bass. Funny thing is, if you go look online, Bobby Bass and Timothy Flowers' reign is not there. I've seen them as champions, so I know it exists, but if you go look on Wikipedia, on Cage Match, on WrestlingData.com, Diamond Timothy Flowers and No Class Bobby Bass title reign is absent. The big storyline for the tag team titles in 1990 would be Leo Burke and Bobby Kay teaming up for the first time in 10 years. They wanted the tag team titles, and they would get the Continental Tag Team titles as they would defeat Diamond Timothy Flowers and No Class Bobby Bass. This title match can be seen on YouTube. One of the young stars in the territory in 1990 is a young Chi-Chi Cruz. He would become a legend in Canadian wrestling and a legend in the Maritimes. Also, in his rookie year, the Acadian Giant. This is the future Kurgan of the WWF. In 1990, he was watching Big Steven Pettipaw's back. The Acadian Giant would later on be in a few movies like Sherlock Holmes, 300, and Deadpool 2. Hustler Rip Rogers, Leo Burke, and Bobby Kay would be the last champions in the original Grand Prix Wrestling. 1990 would be the last year that Grand Prix Wrestling would be Grand Prix Wrestling. One thing I forgot to mention is in 1987, Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling turned into World Grand Prix Wrestling. But starting in 1991, we would get Maritime Championship Wrestling, and in 1992, they would change names again, and it would be Canadian Championship Wrestling. It would be a successor to Grand Prix, but it would not be Grand Prix Wrestling, and Emile Dupree would not be a part of it. But that's a story for another episode. In closing, I'd like to say that without Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling, the promotions you see in the Maritimes nowadays would not exist. I would like to thank all the legends that made Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling the territory in the Maritimes. Thank you to Joel for helping me out in this episode, and thank you all for listening. I'll see you next week.